Good evening and welcome. I'm Arian Mack, professor of psychology at the New School and director of the Center for Public Scholarship here and longtime editor of Social Research, the journal of the New School for Social Research, which began in 1934. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guests and all of the audience to this event on behalf of the New School. We are really pleased to be co-hosting this discussion for many reasons, but primarily because its subject is of great and continuing importance to us. In fact, in 2011, we organized a conference, the 26th in the ongoing Social Research Conference series, on the future of higher education, at which Peter Brooks and others addressed the question of the role of the humanities. Actually, papers from that conference were published, as all our conferences are, as special issues of Social Research, and that particular issue is on sale in the lobby. Actually, also in 2012, the following year, we organized a follow-up discussion among university presidents on a similar topic. So when Peter Brooks asked me last spring whether we would be interested in sponsoring this event, I really was very pleased to say yes and to do so. But not only is tonight's event resonant with our interest in the humanities and in higher education, but also with our abiding concern for the right to academic freedom and free inquiry, which are the principles on which the New School was founded when in 1919, its original faculty, all professors at Columbia, resigned in protest against the demand that they sign loyalty oaths and founded the New School. These principles also were at the heart of the creation of our university in exile, founded in 1933 as the academic home for the threatened scholars rescued from Hitler's Germany by our first president. And these principles continue to be at the heart of this institution today. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce Peter Brooks, who is the real organizer of this event and who will moderate the discussion. He is currently Andrew Mellon Foundation Scholar in the University Center for Human Values and the Department of Comparative Literature at Princeton. He joined the Princeton faculty in 2008 after many decades of teaching at Yale, where he was the Sterling professor of comparative literature and did many, many things there of great importance, including starting the Whitney Humanities Center. He is the author of many books, most recently Enigmas of Identity in 2011, and the co-author of a number of others, including Humanities and Public Life with Hilary Jewett, on which tonight's discussion is based. That book is on sale, as you must know by now, in the lobby.
I'm very grateful to Arian Mack for being so willing to host this occasion, and I want to thank her and also Helen Tarter, the editor at Fordham University Press, who took on this utterly unsaleable volume, slim but elegant, that you see in the lobby, and also Roberta Sutton, who organized tonight's activity. So I will be very brief. I just want to welcome you to this discussion about the humanities in public life. I trust it's not going to be one more ritual lamentation on the crisis of the humanities, but a more productive and probing conversation about what the humanities are, and maybe particularly what they do, and how they can reassert their claim to attention. Once upon a time, of course, we thought the humanities were necessary, even for those who are going to rule the world, especially for those who are going to rule the world. That was certainly true in Britain and Western Europe, where statesmen, as they all were at the time, were taught wisdom through the classics. It was even true, I think, for a fledgling American culture devoted to a certain idea of civic humanism and its tools of debate and communication. That was self-evident. But now, as Judith Butler eloquently warns us in her essay in the Humanities and Public Life, the obvious no longer is obvious. Salient among the many current crises of the humanities is the demand that we justify what we do, the resources we consume, the place that we take up, especially in educational institutions. And this demand for justification is framed in such a way that we cannot fall back on the notion that the humanities are somehow self-justifying, even if we believe it, that they don't need to defend themselves. They do, but how? In what language? Can we accept the metrics proposed by the instrumentalists who don't understand or value what we do? To respond in the language in which we are challenged is to be treasonous to what we do. Yet we must respond. I won't continue myself at this point because I know you want to hear from our panelists. And I know that you're here because you already know who they are. The briefest of introductions. Judith Butler, who is currently the Mellon Visiting Professor of the Humanities at Columbia, and also the Maxine Elliot Professor in the Departments of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature at Berkeley, and author of several books that have had a deep impact on thinking in so many fields I can't even think of them all, including Gendered Trouble, The Psychic Life of Power, Giving an Account of Oneself, and Parting Ways. And Patricia Williams, James L. Dorr Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, widely known for her work on race, gender, and law, also a columnist for The Nation, also author of The Alchemy of Race and Rights, The Rooster's Egg, and Seeing a Colorblind Future. Richard Sennett, University Professor of Sociology at NYU and Professor of Sociology at London School of Economics, author, of course, of classic studies of urbanism, work, and the psychology of society, including The Uses of Disorder, The Fall of Public Man, The Corrosion of Character, The Craftsman, and Together. And finally, William Germano, Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Cooper Union, and before that, a celebrated editor at Columbia University Press and at Routledge, and author of Getting It Published, From Dissertation to Book, and The Tales of Hoffman. Now, I'm not going to ask the panelists to get up and make speeches, but rather I'm going to pitch them a few questions and let them respond to those and to one another. And I hope that after about 45 or 50 minutes, we'll have exhausted the dialogue amongst them and we'll turn things over to the floor. Now, I'm going to go sit down, but I'd better, are these mics all working now? A question that came up so powerfully in this book, and particularly in Judith Butler's essay, which was originally the keynoted address at a conference out of which this book was made, could be restated something like this without Judith's eloquence. How do we speak for the humanities? How do we defend the humanities without using the language and values of those who wish to see knowledge in purely instrumental terms? The conception of knowledge is essentially instrumental as measured by its worldly use value. Seems now to dominate talk about education worldwide, and we're all, as you know, subject to assessments of various types, both students and faculty. So Judith Butler asks in her essay, quote, "Is instrumentality the only way we have of thinking about what it means to make a difference?" So I think first question, or the first person to ask this question to is obviously Judith Butler.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter. I'm really pleased to be here, and I want to thank Peter in particular for bringing us together and for putting this remarkable volume together. I want to thank Fordham University Press as well for its wisdom in publishing it. When people ask me about instrumentality, I'm reminded of a story I heard in London, where a friend of mine was trying to get funding for a conference she wanted to put together on various meanings of monarchy, and she thought to bring scholars from the UK and the Netherlands and Spain and other places where monarchies were still in place in one form or another, and they might all talk together about the meanings of monarchy. And that conference was rejected by the committee that decides on research allocations. And they said, well, what would the impact of such a conference be? Can you please, describe impact? This just seems like a bunch of people sitting around discussing ideas. So then she thought about what the impact might be, and she wrote back and she said, well, it could lead to the possible dissolution of the monarchy. And of course, they were terribly unhappy with that response, and she did not get the funding. Okay, so even when we take a term like impact, right, which has become extremely important in the Bologna Accords, in the so-called REF in the UK, and certainly in many metric systems that now govern research in the humanities here in the United States as well, we're already talking about certain kinds of impact and not other kinds of impact, right? So there are certain kinds of political schemes that are deciding what kinds of impact will count as impact and what kinds will not. So radical social transformation is not, I think, an impact. I mean, I think an impact is something that has measurable consequences or that we can see. Actually, what it is, for the most part, is work that then produces readers or other work that is finally measurable, right? So the metric emerges and measurability emerges, I think, as a kind of final gauge, so that even terms like impact, which could involve social transformation, seem to be reduced to something like had an effect on public consciousness as demonstrated by the following hits on an internet site. So one question that I have, I mean, I'm all in favor of having scholarship that affects the world in some way, but sometimes those effects are in the classroom when a student says to me, as she said 2 days ago, it's really hard. Every time I read one of these texts, I think that must be right, and then the next week I read a different one and I think that must be right. And she says, I guess I'll have to sort that out in my paper. And I thought, yes. All right, but how do I, where does that little mini impact tally, right? How does that tally? It seems to me it doesn't tally. And I just want to say, it's true, we can't be totally nostalgic and simply oppose all metrics and all quantitative methods and all language of instrumentality. I think that would be perhaps self-destructive, and yet what kind of translation can we make such that we don't end up transfiguring what we do into something we do not do and do not actually believe in? So that practice of translation is a delicate one, it seems to me. We have to avoid nostalgia on the one hand, for sure, although it is a huge temptation, I have to say. I never thought I'd be a nostalgic person, but I'm having that nostalgia. And we also have to, in a way, refuse all assimilation, complete assimilation into these metrics, which do, in some ways, entail a decimation of what we do in an effort to show that what we do has value. So finally, I just want to say this. Nietzsche wrote a good book, some of you probably know, on the genealogy of morals, and he asked this really peculiar question, which is, what is the value of our moral values? The value of our moral values. I mean, do we measure the value of our moral values by our moral values? No, he must be saying something else. He must be asking, how is this system of valuation how did it come to be, and why do we value it, and what finally is the value? What finally is the value of this system? So it seems to me we could ask the question of what is the value of the scheme of values, the metric system that has taken hold, and asked us to justify what we do in light of its terms. And I want to suggest that actually we maybe could go back to basic terms like metric, right? What would it mean if we actually gave our own alternative genealogy of metric? It would include meter, measure, poetry, music. It would include Aristotle's ethics, right? It would include Shakespeare, measure for measure. It would include all kinds of meanings and connotations that are, I would say, forgotten or rendered illegible by the current term, and yet are there as part of its constitutive history. So what would it mean for us to uncover those forgotten meanings and mobilize them again in relationship to metric or instrumentality? Let's go back to the idea of the instrument. The instrument, the musical instrument, the voice as instrument. Instrumental, the critique of instrumental reason, that extraordinary feat of the Frankfurt School, one that was, I think, popularized in the English language in this institution. There's so much we could do. Utility. Let's go back to Mill. What did he mean, and what were those debates? And where did it exist beforehand? And where's the history or genealogy of those terms that have been forgotten in a way but still haunt and have the capacity to disrupt the present discourse? So I say rather than refuse or reject all those terms and keep ourselves pure, I say perhaps we need to look at the way those terms are implicated in a kind of genealogy or a history that the humanities is singularly well equipped to illuminate. And that would be to mobilize those ghosts of meaning that are threatened with oblivion, precisely, perhaps against and through this contemporary language.
Terrific. And I want to come back to measure for measure. I think that's a wonderful notion. But just to move on for the moment, I think we may want to be skeptical of the argument that's often put forth in defense of the humanities, that the humanities make you a better person, that reading great literature, listening to great music, viewing great paintings, make you morally better. I think there are plenty of examples to the contrary, including people of great culture who have committed great atrocities. Nonetheless, it may be true that the kind of imaginative empathy cultivated in seeing the world through other eyes and reading fiction and viewing a painting, for instance, is a kind of precondition of understanding claims, including rights of others. And I thought maybe I'd turn to the person on my right, who's an expert in rights, and ask Patricia if she would want to talk about that. I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, it's, I guess, it's not the question I'd expected, but actually it ties into what I think I was thinking anyway, which is, I teach contract law. That's the core course that I've taught for many, many years. And contract is perhaps one of the more constricted moral universes in jurisprudence, in the sense that it really doesn't involve the wider ethic of, for example, constitutional law or what constitutes us. It's not the constitutive jurisprudence of what pulls us together as a polis. It really is about, what we individually opt to do, what we choose to do. And in that sense, it's a rather constricted body of jurisprudence. But at the same time, traditionally, or at least for about the last 100 years, it has involved really interesting. I mean, that's why I like it so much. It's sort of it's an interesting device for interpreting language, and it orders time, it fixes expectations, one looks at intentions, one sets up a series of rules for that, one plays with them. It's not the most multivocal body of law in the sense of, it sort of envisions a kind of bipolarity of parties who get together and they negotiate, but it's not the kind of pluralism that one finds even in tort or in constitutional law. But at the same time, interpreting contract, I think, has required some understanding of how to read based in the humanities. And a kind of recognition that there are many meanings operating simultaneously. And contract law pushes you for a kind of clarity that tests all the time. But it's part of the reason, actually, and that's what I was thinking when Judy was talking, it's part of the reason that in my essay I actually used, a sort of a G clef and a C clef and a F clef, is that literally if you read those three at the same time, there's a way in which they talk to each other, or they're talking, they're meant to be heard at the same time. And then in the coda at the end, maybe hear them all together. And in that sense, it's a stilted, very lawyerly kind of conceit, but it's a way of my attempt to express some of what what we try to capture, what I think is captured by the study of the humanities, that sense of voices at the same time, speaking harmonically or putting or levels of meaning on top of one another. That has shifted recently, dramatically, in the study of contract law. In the last decade or so, the law and economics movement has really reduced a great deal of the emphasis on language to a kind of abstracted emphasis on hyper-econometric symbols. And the Coase theorem is much more important in contracts than the meaning of particular words. And that, I think, has placed less and less emphasis on the value of the human beings doing the transacting. And you have a new set of rules that have shifted from formulating expectations when one drafts a contract to risk assessment almost retrospectively. So the whole temporal frame has shifted, and you have, and language itself has almost disappeared. And so, and I'm speaking specifically of the set of rules that you are all familiar with when you press I agree on an iTunes, whatever. Or shrink-wrapped package, you open it up and you don't know the terms beforehand. You don't know them until you've actually already paid for it and taken it home, and then you find, a zillion pieces of fine print. This is something the consumer movement of the 70s and 80s worked very, very hard to make otherwise. It's Elizabeth Warren's mission, I think, in life to reverse this trend. But nevertheless, it is the trend that dominates much of what we call contract law now, and it makes language invisible because most people absolutely never read it, even people like me. I press the iTunes, I agree. Where I think this makes a huge difference is the way in which technology is taking over the project of education and so much, and of knowledge generally, just across the board. If you read the piece in the New Yorker by George Packer this week about Amazon.com and the way in which it's affecting the publishing industry, you may want to start reading the terms of service and the privacy agreements on Amazon.com, actually print them off. Sometimes they're as much as 20 to 40 pages long that you're agreeing to. But also the phenomenon known as massive online education, MOOCs. A lot of people sort of have consumed these like they're consuming Pepsi-Cola because they taste so good, and they're really great courses. I have no war with that. But if you actually read the terms of service and the privacy agreements, they put cookies on your computer. They require, edX, for example, requires that all the students, the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of students become research subjects. Information based on who you are, how you learn. The subject of neurological studies are now starting to be published as a result of massive online education. And I don't think people have a clue that they are actually research subjects. And the ethics of that, of universities signing up where students become research subjects, and not just research subjects, but that their information, what they put in the discussion groups, isn't owned by the students. It is actually used for to create the product of and sold to researchers, and the product ultimately, I think, of probably software, learning software. And in that sense, I think that some of what we're seeing in education is going to be the kind of revolution one has already seen in the publishing industry, but that bricks and mortar schools are going to sacrifice a lot of the intimacy and the incredible time it takes and the learning that occurs just in hanging out. But if you notice, if you go on those things, if you actually try to write up your notes online and then try to print them off, in many instances you can't print them off because they actually own them. If you notice on your Kindle, if you try to print off your notes, you can't do that. And so I think that, what does it mean to let your mind wander when in fact you are being surveyed, not in the way that the NSA is, but you're being surveyed in a way that makes a product of every utterance in that space.
So much to come back to. Let me though, since we have a sociologist here, let me ask a question specifically bold at him down the aisle. Recent experiments by psychologists, and I gather that they actually were working at the New School, have tended to demonstrate that people who spend time reading complex fictions about social interaction, Jane Austen, George Elliot, Henry James, in fact develop greater skills in inferring the emotions and decoding the behavior of those they interact with. Now, we who teach literature always knew that to be true, right? But do we want the learning of social skills to be the goal of our teaching? So, and more generally, this led me, reading this stuff, led me to ask anew, what do we mean when we claim with Matthew Arnold that literature is a criticism of life? You want to take that on, Richard?
Not really, but I want to answer perhaps or discuss a little of the question behind your question. Let me say, first of all, that I really am glad to be here again. My godfather founded the University in Exile at the New School, and was one of a vast number of people who, but for your institution, would have gone under during the Nazi period. So it's I'm really glad to come to speak to you, and it's something about the New School that I think is unique in American education, and. I guess just following on from what Pat was saying, I'd like to say something about what's a paradox. It's sometimes called Burckhardt's paradox. And it's that very complex forms of technology produce great simplicity, that out of complexity you have what Burckhardt himself, he was a 19th century historian, called brutal simplification. And he looked at the modern world as an age of brutal simplifiers. And we're in the midst of one version of that now, which is that there's been a terrific technological revolution in the last 30 years, which is producing simpler and simpler, more and more user-friendly material, which is destimulating rather than stimulating. I think that's what's behind your question, which is, why is it that we are using technology to make things easy rather than more dense, more difficult, and therefore more engaging? In the world I travel in, which is a world which has a lot of technology, people built into it, this is a source, believe it or not, of some guilt. that people see that the technological, devising of new kernels or new apps tend to be streamlined and commercialized in ways that dumb down. And the technological process of dumbing down is an enormously complex one. Amazon, for instance, is one of the most sophisticated technological programs you could imagine. So are many of the apps on your iPhone. But the idea is that people do not want, they want the more passive experience of using these to do something easily, the one click without reading the so on, without reading the agreements and so on. This is a big issue in technology, whether this is just capitalist domination or whether there's something really about the formations of technology, about the practice of techne, which means that this path towards what Burckhardt called brutal simplification is occurring. If you took this out of the digital format, used it, for instance, about a building like this, it's an interesting building, but let us say there are marks of brutal simplification in it, and those are produced by incredibly sophisticated technological means. So it's a real paradox for techies, and it's something that I think lies behind a lot of the fear in humanistic culture about being made irrelevant. If it were only so simple that, you know, these capitalist pigs were using this wonderful technology for the purposes of consumer friendliness, consumer ease, if it were only that simple, the real engagement in this is whether there is something in the way we conceive about the practice of technology that offers us, if you like, an opportunity for brutal simplification to occur. So I guess that's the opposite behind the question, is reading George Eliot good for you? Well, of course it is. But the question is, why is that not a menu, an option on the menu that people are
Why we don't
choosing?
want a George Eliot app, right?
Well, I would like
We
one.
probably already use one.
But it would not fly. But I'm just saying, it's the one thing about this, you can say it's, you know, it's all capitalist domination and consumerism and so on. That's much too simple. There's something deeper in our culture that has identified easiness, simplicity, transparency as something more desirable than something that challenges you mentally. That's difficult to use. If I could just say one more thing about this. If you go into a program like Linux, which is a really, it's a program you could use, you could program in. Its kernel, which is the basic set of instructions, is open to a user to really manipulate in a way that you could never manipulate the Microsoft kernel. There's a huge debate among Linux people about why it is that nonetheless almost all the apps written out of Linux use a tiny bit of the complexity and engagement that you could use with this wonderful piece of technology. The idea of being engaged by difficulty, being aroused by it, is something that doesn't seem to be in the culture of how an instrument like that is used. So that to me is a kind of humanistic challenge within the technological world.
Great, thank you, Richard. Well, let me just quote one more line from our collective book here, and this is from Anthony Appiah, who had hoped to be here, but is in Italy, I believe, at the moment. Appia writes, like all artistic practices, reading flourishes only when people as creators and as audience are committed to continuing an ongoing conversation. So I like that phrase, and I wonder if it offers us something of a model to talk about the question of the humanities in relation to public life. And I think, Judith, somewhere in your paper, your essay, you talk about the academic seminar as a model of civic engagement. So if that's true, shouldn't we be worried that the humanities seem to be becoming more and more the province of elite educational institutions and to be dropped completely in many other sectors of higher education? And the obvious person to start us off on this is Dean Germano.
Well, when I'm asked to speak these days, I wind up identifying myself as an administrator, professor, and recovering publisher. And it's very difficult to step away from a role that is as complex as the role of a scholarly publisher, certainly in the 21st century, in our current economy, and in the midst of a national conversation or the absence of that conversation concerning the value of the work that the people in this room are committed to, as evident by their presence. My random notes, almost random notes for this panel derive almost exclusively from reading the book. It's one thing to be at a conference, it's another to go back and get to see beautifully edited and printed versions of those talks and to go through them. So I found myself taking notes on what I had heard live, and some of the things that lodged in my brain like splinters are ideas or locutions created by people who are not on the panel, so I want to kind of invoke them even though they're not here. One is my friend and colleague Ralph Hexter from UC Davis, who put before us the phrase shared interpretive labor. And I think that's a really, really important concept, not only to put out there, but to embrace. Both the laboriousness of interpretation, that it is work and not whim, and that it is necessarily collective, that it is impossible for a writer to exist without a reader, that texts are animated, they are given meaning only when they are absorbed or repudiated, but in some sense, we must engage with those texts. I also think that what I do, whatever it is hard work, and I like the idea of shared interpretive labor. I'd also point to the very handsome book from Fordham University Press as an example itself of shared interpretive labor. That scholarly publishing is actually a dimension of academic life which is frequently undervalued, and the bookstore, which was classically the temple in which we observed these collectively produced objects, now is disappearing, and we are, as my colleagues on the panel have indicated, left with this sort of absence, perhaps they haven't called it a longing, but online is a very different form of engagement for purchasing work than the curated space of something like the Harvard bookstore, for example, where I could walk in and not leave until closing time if I had nothing else on my calendar. Sort of as a sidebar, I found that mailings from publishers, catalogs, things that I might have thrown away 5 years ago, now sit on my desk. I don't want them to go away. I have to study these things because they represent, in a deeply diminished way, a different curatorial act, a different shared interpretive labor, an opportunity to study what professionals in the field have created and presented for my attention. I'm working on Shakespeare and music right now, and so the notion of the metric has been one that's been very much part of my life, and I was teaching Midsummer Night's Dream to students yesterday, so this stuff is really in my head at the moment. I tend to think very lexically, and I wanted to just bring before the group here the easiest of bits of research going to the OED to see where humanities sits on a timeline of English language and also, by extension, discursive practices. The term humanities, like so much of the contemporary world, is a footnote to the 17th century. That may be a prejudice, but from where I sit, almost everything begins there, for good or for ill. But for almost 2 centuries before the 17th century, at least according to the OED, the term humanities is not humanities, but humanity, with pretty much a similar meaning. The earliest site in OED is Caxton's translation of the Golden Legend in 1483, and makes reference, I love this phrase, the double science, that is to say, divinity and humanity. So I take away from this the humanity as opposed to divinity, but humanity at least orthographically as distinct from humanities. And for me, that slight adjustment is very powerful. We study humanity. It seems to me is more meaningful than to say that I studied the humanities. I confess that while I have the title of Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, I do not understand what those terms mean. The distinction between humanities and social sciences seems to me predicated on a set of metrics that don't actually translate into either practice or the goals I set as an educator or as an interested reader. The kinds of questions that are threaded through Peter's conference and the volume that's emerged from it seem to me to return repeatedly to what constitutes fidelity on the part of the reader. And that the act of faithfulness in reading is central to a legitimate ethical relationship between reader, text, and writer. Peter's phrase, close, attentive, faithful, interpretive acts of reading, to me has a profoundly diagnostic cast to it, the physician and the textual patient. And it conjures up for me images of 18th century paintings in which physician is examining urine before a prone woman whose life may be changed at the moment that occurs after we pass away from the canvas. Looking at the supine, fully dressed, suffering body. I often feel that way when I'm looking at a text, though the suffering body is my own, not the text in front of me. And I think frequently in this book, what we're dealing with are questions of how our senses should be operating if they're operating ideally. And Judith has a terrific phrase in her paper in the volume, isn't it strange being quoted by someone who's sitting next to you? The education of the senses as a precondition of what we might call a sensate democracy. I thought sensate democracy is an extraordinary phrase and one that I want to chew on, not today, not this evening in front of you, but to live with and see if I can import that into my own sense of what we expect the consequences of reading to be. But I like the idea of a refurbished sensorium, and that the study of humanity, which is what we do, can help us understand what functions our senses should undertake. Pat Williams has a phrase in her talk that sits powerfully with me. How did the humanities become a product rather than a relation? How do we become customers rather than citizens? And it seems to me that that centrally identifies not only one of the appalling challenges we face as a culture, but also helps us to identify what goals we should be setting for ourselves as teachers and as professional readers and as professionals who were teaching non-professionals how to read, which is as important as training graduate students. The notion of divinity versus humanity brings me to the point of Emerson's great essay, in which he talks about a system of ethics being defined as a system of human duties commencing from man, even given the necessary gender correction in that passage. This notion of the human duties as commencing from man returns us, I think, to the obligation to determine through what we do with our texts how they will change us and how they will change the world. In Richard's comments in the volume on elite institutions, he shrewdly makes an observation about some elite institutions of technical specialization, like MIT, or Cooper Union, where I teach, where half the students are engineers and half in studio art and architecture, but we have no undergraduate students or graduate students either in the liberal arts. The elite institutions, the very finest, value music and literature and make those disciplines part of the pedagogical project. But in Richard's analysis, this is a luxury not necessarily available to the non-technical institution. And he goes on to infer a parallel opportunity at those elite technical institutions to valorize problem finders rather than problem solvers. This resonates with something that I've felt very strongly over many years now, that the function of the humanities is the invention of difficulty. And I take invention in the double sense of both discovery and creation, that our jobs is to make things more complicated, not complicated in the sense of the committee that refuses to decide anything, but complicated in a truly deep way, so that the consequence of reading is demonstrable, if not measurable. That is the metric with which Judith began. The question of the metric is always before us. But the metric can only be meaningful if we ourselves define what those consequences would be and how we would know whether they were achieved. My sense of where scholarly publishing has to go, and indeed all scholarly endeavor, is for us to recalibrate our writing goals such that we can imagine the consequence of what we do. That a kind of consequentialism, if that term hasn't already been used in more sophisticated ways by analytic philosophy, seems to me a good working rubric for imagining not only a relationship between author and reader, but before that, between the author and his or her text.
Thank you, Bill. I think there probably are many voices in the audience who want to be heard, so I will just ask one more question of everyone, which I hope will kind of bring together a lot of what's been said here. I think we all agree that the humanities is a process and a practice, a praxis, rather than a product, rather than a deliverable, which is a term that Judith talks about in her essay. And it's always seemed to me that interpretation in the humanities, reading, and I don't just mean reading texts, but artifacts, art objects as well, that interpretation involves a certain self-dispossession, right? Teachers in the humanities are always listening to other voices and trying to make other voices from the past, voices embodied in texts, or voices for objects that cannot speak for themselves, like paintings and sculpture, make them speak in the classroom, so that there's always a sort of sense of ventriloquism in teaching in the humanities. You're rarely speaking only in your own voice. And it seems to me that this is part of the ethics of reading and interpretation in the humanities, of achieving a certain stereophonic voice and being faithful to the sound of other voices. But what I want to ask our panelists and then everyone is, if this is true of interpretation and of teaching in the humanities, what does this mean in terms of metrics, of how do we find measure for measure in terms of what we do? So I give you all a few minutes to bounce this back around among yourselves, and then I'll turn to the audience. Judith, do you want to say anything more?
Well, I think it's interesting that we're left with the question, what do we do, which is a little bit different from what value do we have, since part of what we have to do is to demonstrate the value of what we do. And I think that act of demonstration involves a complex act of translation. And as I suggested earlier, I think it's an act of translation not only between or among various idioms, but also among different institutions and to different audiences. So it's interesting to me, even just this last year, I know a 19th century Americanist who's learned how to be an expert on the closing and merging of departments, and had to establish literacy on that issue. And I know a surrealist who happens to be really good at graphs and has a mathematical background, good for her, and is able to make arguments about the humanities by using those graphs and being able to demonstrate ratios. And of course, Christopher Newfield has made, I think, some of the most sweeping and persuasive arguments about what the actual monetary value is that the humanities offers to universities, and that undergraduate income actually, due to the humanities, precisely because humanities are offered, is an indispensable source of revenue for most universities. At the same time, we're hearing that universities are cutting programs or don't really see the value of the humanities, or when under a condition of so-called fiscal crisis, believe that humanities are the first thing, humanities and the arts, and let's add that always, humanities and the arts are and languages are the first things to be cut, right? So actually, I wonder, really, first of all, whether we should accept the idea of a fiscal crisis. I mean, of course there's a fiscal crisis, but for a fiscal crisis to entail cuts in arts, humanities, and languages, there has to be a set of decision-making processes in the middle whereby people ask, well, where do we cut? And they say there. And they give reasons for cutting there, or they fail to give reasons for cutting there, right? So there's a justificatory scheme in the middle of that, which allows a fiscal crisis to be linked to certain kinds of cuts. And that's precisely where the question of values is. You know, what is of value to an institution? What is of value to a university? Can a university be a university in name and without the humanities and without languages and without the arts? Okay, so those are sort of, you know, that's one set of questions. And I think learning where and how to identify those institutional moments of decision-making and make them accountable, bring them out into public for open debate is really, really crucial. And the other thing I want to say is that we have to become translators, but at least, you know, many of us in literature, at least in comparative literature, translation is like everywhere, all the time. We think about translation. We are the people who know how to think about translation, right? So, I actually think there is a kind of translation among idioms, as I've suggested, but also, I don't know anyone working in a private or a public institution at this point who can afford not to think about the conditions of our labor and the justification for what we do. We are involved in that practice, no matter if we are Dante scholars or queer theorists or performance artists. We're involved in understanding what the infrastructural conditions are that make our work possible, what the labor relations are that make our work possible, the acceleration of adjunct and temporary labor and how that shifts the university and course offerings and what we mean by education. All of these issues are ones that we have to become literate. We have to establish literacies in that. So, you know, that's not just showing that they're great people who read George Eliot and that actually comes out in the great things they do. I actually love George Eliot, and I would be a much more impoverished human being without George Eliot, and I'm willing to make that case in public as well. But what I want to say is that is that we have a kind of obligation to develop technical and idiomatic literacies in order to preserve the conditions and adapt the conditions of our work and produce compelling justifications for what we do that will actually be able to intervene in those decision-making processes that decide what's going to be a discipline and what's not, what's going to be a field and what's not. And then lastly, and I'm sorry I'm going on, but I just have to get this last point in, I think we have to think about political censorship in these terms as well. When something called critical race theory, which is, of course, an established discipline and an extremely important field that has been worked over now for a couple of decades, when something called critical race theory, and I'm using it that way because when the Arizona State Legislature calls it critical race theory, it really has nothing to do with that discipline. They haven't read that discipline. They haven't gone home and studied and figured out what they really think about that discipline, okay? But when they decide to ban works that belong to critical race theory because they're un-American or they threaten the identity of the state, or when thousands of people go out into the streets in France recently demonstrating against the theory of gender, really? Because it appalls their, you know, because the Pope is offended, or maybe the traditional family is going to be destroyed by this word. You know, I think we have to ask, you know, how do those kinds of operations of political censorship become fears about donation, become fears about funding, become fears about public relation, and actually do translate into curricular decisions and cuts, right? How do they enter into that matrix that's saying fiscal crisis, cut, right? One moves to the other. No, there is that justificatory scheme that's right in the middle. And there are political issues that come in, and there are also really fundamental issues of value that come in. And we're not going to be able to speak to it without being competent in several discourses.
Great.
Sorry.
Pat, are you banned in Arizona?
Yeah, actually, yeah. I did a column about that in The Nation. You can find it, yeah, because but you know, so is Walt Whitman, so is Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
They banned The Tempest because it was too political and inciting.
I saw that.
Yeah, it was so. It's one thing to, you know, to be banned and you know, sort of take pride in one's political, you know, uppityness, but it's another thing when it's like they banned everything that you could call literature, actually. I guess it's so interesting to me because when I hear the word dispossession, on the one hand, you know, the notion of negative capability brings to my mind something like the really extraordinary bit of journalistic coverage of it's called The Invisible Child by Andrea Elliot that was on the front page of the New York Times it was a sequence of 5 stories about this homeless child in New York. And it was done, and what was extraordinary to me was that it was done over the period of a year. They took the time, they talked to people at every level of the agencies that affected this child's life. They talked about gentrification. I thought she did a really interesting job in never condescending, and actually, despite the dire circumstances of this child's life, introducing humor and real sympathy for this character. And it's something that struck me because one sees that so little in journalism right now. And that, to me, is a reflection of the other kind of dispossession, which is not simply that the author steps back in order to present this incredibly multifaceted life, but that a lot of journalism, local journalism, for example, is outsourced, and somebody in the Philippines is writing actually your local news. Or that, in fact, I just want to read you what students who do not read, who take a course on one of the massive online, the license grant to, this is from edX, regarding user postings. You hereby grant to edX a worldwide, non-exclusive, transferable, assignable, sub-licensable, fully paid up, royalty-free, perpetual, irrevocable right and license to host, transfer, display, perform, reproduce, modify, distribute, redistribute, relicense, and otherwise use, make available, and exploit your user posting in whole or in part, in any form and in any media formats and through any media channels now known or hereafter developed.
There's grounds for litigation there.
So somewhere, I mean, between the two poles of journalism as we once knew it, and this kind of sphere in which we're writing on a platform, which is the ultimate kinds of proprietary dispossession. I struggle for the language to sort of bring these together because dispossession in that generous, giving over, pricelessness sense is coming up against a world in which freedom, and particularly academic freedom is more and more constrained by the notion of the trustees' interest in most universities in branding a university, in making academics sell their product. This, I think, was also the subject of a front-page story in the New York Times about, for example, foreign universities, which are actually, like China, for example, which are actually also government entities investing in American universities, which are supposedly exchanges, but when they engage in practices that defy some of our liberal tradition, can American faculties break with those partnerships or challenge them without setting the trustees' hearts aflutter because it's going to affect the branding or because of the investment in that. And I think that notion, and there's been, I think, if one reads Trustee Magazine, a real sense of wanting to confine academic freedom the way in which management wants to confine labor. And so again, these two meanings of possession and dispossession are on some sort of collision course.
Interesting. Look, I don't want to dispossess Richard and Bill, but I'm also tempted to open things to the floor. Is that all right? Do you have final words, footnotes?
There's just one thing that I came to this event wanting to get out just because it's been in my brain since the MLA. And Marianne Hirsch had a wonderful session at MLA this year, in which Judith was a speaker, but I'm not quoting Judith at this point. It was a phrase that was uttered by Ariella Azoulay in Complet at Brown, and it's really resonated with me, and that is our right not to abuse others, which struck me as an extraordinary series of words that completely turned the terms under which abuse could be conceptualized and the notion of our right. What would it mean to identify that right? How could we actualize it? How would it be possible for us to assert our right not to abuse others? And what would the consequence of that assertion be in the world? I think in many ways, the essays in the project that this book memorializes are ethical questions that move in an orbit around Azoulay's phrase. I just put that there because I think the resonances are powerful, and I'd like you guys all to have that phrase in your heads after tonight.
Well, I just say one thing to answer your question about metrics. You know that I think in a way you're giving metrics a bad rap if you look at it as something rigid. There are metaphors and allegories in mathematics. Mathematical thinking has some of the same poetic properties that literary thinking has.
Yes, but that's not the kind of metrics that's being applied
Right.
to us.
But what I'm saying is that this kind of metric that is being applied to you is actually not a metric. That is, in the proper sense of the word, because a measure is a problem in mathematics. And what's being done here is something else. It's an assignation of arbitrary value. There's nothing, the reason I say this, Peter, is that there's no two cultures issue about this. You know, science versus humanities.
No, I don't think it's...
It's pure power.
yeah.
And that kind of assignation of value, which is not a scientific thing at all, is a power play. It comes out of people who want to, I agree with both Judith and Pat. I disbelieve, every time somebody tells me I want to cut your budget, I think, what's your hidden motive? What don't you like about what I'm doing? You know? And the use of metrics, or these assigned numbers, is a way of hiding a power relationship. So I don't think your question, if I may say so, I've known him over 50 years, your question is not quite sharp.
Okay, but you in Britain, you know, with the research assessment evaluation, certainly...
But that's
know
all assignation of value. That is, how much influence does something
Impact,
have?
right.
Impact.
Yep, no, I know.
Let's call it 10.
Okay, it's vicious in any case.
Yes.
It certainly is time to hear from our captive audience. I understand there's actually only one microphone on the floor, Roberta told me, and I believe I see it over there. So if you want to ask a question, it would be good to wend your way over there. And you know, questions and comments are welcome. Speeches, not so much so.
Is it possible to turn
go
up the
ahead.
lights so that we can see you? Is that possible?
Yes.
I'm wondering if the any of the panelists had read Nicholas Kristof's article in the New York Times. I think it was in the last week or two. I think the generally bemoaning kind of the lack of public intellectuals, and I think, you know, an implicit criticism of the academy. I think he characterized them as, compared them, many members of the academy, to kind of cloistered medieval monks who, you know, probably have a lot to contribute to public debate, but really aren't out there kind of doing that. And I think it's part of that was also a criticism of the discourse. You know, maybe not that there was a kind of the opposite of maybe what Richard Sennett was saying, which is that there's almost a brutal complexity to a lot of academic discourse, and unnecessarily so, in a way that hampers the ability of the academy to, you know, interact with the public. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I should have asked you to say who you are for the benefit of the audience.
I prefer not to identify myself, if you don't mind. Just a private individual.
Man.
Certainly, I read the Kristov article, and my impression is that the Times runs this article once every few months. They just give it different bylines. I was sort of surprised to see it under Kristov's byline. I thought he would have been more intelligent than that, but it was appalling. Anyone else want to comment? Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Rich Blint, Columbia University. And I've been sitting here for the conversation. I'm thinking how old the question is. I'm thinking really about Stuart Hall. who just died recently, who we're honoring soon at Columbia. And that for him, this was his life's work. And also who he was, a humble, generous, non-academic in that way, right? And so I'm thinking how, as an academic myself, I feel disconnected from this conversation. I'm wondering if we change the title to the University and Public Life and actually court transformation as not an impossibility, but a desire, that somehow the attack in the humanities is not a momentary thing. It's about, as Richard says, power. And that all of the ways in which we have to think about how to move forward has to be comprehensive. So I say all that to say, what do we do, the question that Professor Butler made about transforming the university itself, the rabid privatization, the attack in academic freedom, all the things that we lament and try to fight around and about, what might it mean for us to radically revision the university in the context of a Stefano Harvey or Fred Moten, the University of the Honor Commons, that wonderful piece that they do, and not imagine that the project of transforming this space is impossible, is somehow, not at all desirable, but that we have a different kind of labor to do, that it might be that the vocational pleasure we take from the classroom is simply not enough. That's what I'm asking, I'm sorry.
Great. Anyone want to take that on?
Well, I don't know. I perhaps have a unusual take on this. I actually believe in universities, and I think in my bailiwick they are really a defense. Things about urban design, development, high technology, they're a defense against other kinds of institutions which are much, much more constricting. I worked for some years for parts of the UN. If you think universities are deadly, I think your problem is, in social sciences, it's true in the law too. It's a choice about where you work, and there are some really good things about choosing to work in universities. Where else would you go in the humanities than a university? What else could you do? Maybe that's why I take the prior speaker's comment that, a university may not be the right setting for public life, for public intellectuals, but where else would you go?
One of the places you would go is publishing. And for many years, that's where people did go. In my generation and the crop of editors who came of age in the 80s and late 70s, Bill Sisler, Lindsay Waters, Bill Regier, Joan Catapano, were intellectuals who moved into university press settings, and I can say that, I want to put this carefully to get it right, I have never been in an environment more intellectually stimulating than the best years I spent in publishing. And that was because everything was fresh, everything was happening. You were seeing things before, you were not merely ahead of the curve, you had the chance to affect the curve. The agency of work in publishing is extraordinarily greater than the agency most of us enjoy as professors. And that, I think, points to one of the problems that the university's current structure enshrines. But it may be the case that was always the case, and this is merely the experience of my lifetime.
Well, there certainly was a point in American history where intellectuals were more in little magazines than in universities. And one of the problems is that those mediating structures, like quarterlies, have sort of etiolated, and it's just us and them now. It's the university and a larger community that doesn't have much use for us, at least the humanistic part of the university. I'm sorry, Judith.
Oh, no, I just wanted to go back to the last speaker's remark and say that one of the things that Stuart Hall did that was so remarkable is that he actually was able to establish a new field through the Birmingham School by not just by establishing new objects of study, Black youth culture or style and music in the UK and in London in particular, but actually through making certain kinds of alliances between the classroom and those musical dance performance practices and allowing for there to be a crucial exchange there. And that continued, I think, later in life when he worked primarily with galleries in order to showcase new art and to bring about public conversation on race and immigration in the UK. So that's kind of an example, I think, of, we could say, making the university more porous, or rather understanding what the relations are that the university has to its environment, and actually taking that as our practice, taking that as our object, taking that as our site of knowledge and our site of exchange. So it was a quite extraordinary contribution, and it does suggest a different kind of practice, one that we may well be losing as we are asked to conform to narrower and narrower standards of academic work.
Hi there, Kimberly, just a citizen. Comment and 2 questions. The comment is, I have actually been through a doc program. My field was really disabilities mixed with ethnic studies and multiculturalism. I was kind of investigating this whole school-to-prison pipeline stuff before it was a phenomenon, just based on my observations as a classroom teacher in certain different populations. And I remember when it was time to do my research, I really had a lot of discouragement from my professors and my doc crew about doing a quantitative analysis. And even though this is what my folks and my team was telling me to do, really I knew in my heart and from analyzing the world around me that, well, I've always thought about college, it's not a measure, a degree, it's not a measure of intelligence, it's a measure of how many hurdles you can jump through and jump over, and you're a good hurdle jumper. But similarly, having the tools and skills to do quantitative analysis and have really good and strong empirical analysis, Judith, it's the point you were making. I mean, you talked about language. I looked at it as a situation that this is the language that funders are speaking. You know, this is the language grant writers are speaking, and I want to have that language, not only so I can access those sources, but so I can critically analyze stuff that's being put forth as truth and knowledge and say, well, this is, you know, really be able to poke through. If you can't speak the language, you can't tell if you're being handed nonsense, for, you know, a more appropriate term. So I think it's really critically important, I just want to state this for the record, that for people who have a brain and a heart for the humanities, that they also learn to speak quantitative language and analyze their works through that lens, because it just makes it all the more powerful. Humanities is so powerful to begin with. How much more powerful if you can, you know, add this other stuff to it. It's very, very critically important. I think that people are going to get left behind, and I certainly wouldn't encourage any young person not to have those skills. The second is a question. Informed consent, these universities that are doing these studies on kids, how are they getting around the informed consent, and, you know, are they disclosing these matters openly so that, I mean, are people aware, and is it enough, you know, in terms of their human subject clearance, the request to do research on human subjects? I'm just wondering how they're actually getting around that, collecting all these data and doing all this stuff without people knowing. And then also, when we click I agree, like on contracts from Amazon, is there no requirement that, what's the assessment of our capacity to even understand? I mean, the capacity of the subject is something you have to judge this person has capacity, but I could barely comprehend, that very complicated thing you read. So I have questions about capacity. And then the last thing is, you said your contract law is largely about preparing for potential risk and future risk, and I just wondered if there's any, on the horizon, anything that may be emerging that would give us hope and encouragement instead of like preparing for future risk. Maybe there's preparing for future, like unimagined bliss. I just wondered if you've seen anything like that. Thank you.
I think this has your name on it, Pat. You want to say anything?
I will let you know when I see unimagined bliss, but I'm not exactly certain how to I guess the let me give you the sort of stream of consciousness that was going on in my mind while you were talking, which is that the contract, the shift in contract law to which I was about which I'm most concerned, is part of a sort of ideological shift that is not simply in contract. I mean, even if you read the New Yorker piece about Amazon, the word libertarian keeps floating up. And I think this is not just Ayn Randian libertarianism. There's a way in which there's an econometric, self-contained, we are rational actors with no, transaction costs, no emotions, that has inflected everything in this culture. And so, I think I'm on this panel not because I'm a humanities instructor, but my profession is the law, which is also under attack to the extent it has anything to do with the humanities, and because it is an interpretive. But I mean, if you read the papers, you will see that law schools are suffering because there has been such an ideological attack on law schools. People are not applying to them because supposedly you're not going to get your value added. That the education is worth nothing because you won't be able to get a job in a big law firm, even though when you actually look at the legal profession, there's a huge range of middle-class consumers who need divorces and bankruptcies and poor people in prison, the school-to-prison pipeline. I mean, there's an extraordinary need for legal representation in our society, and yet it's being represented that law school is a waste of time and a waste of money. And I think, again, at the heart of this ideology, whatever you call it, it's not just libertarianism in this general sense, but I'm using that as a cipher for this cultural fog. It is what Richard called power. I mean, it is the fact that there has been, I think it's a handy way of dispersing power. It's a handy way of attacking perhaps the legacy of the civil rights movement when there was a kind of collective political power. It disappears when you put it in this highly contractarian, individual, I assume my responsibility, but nobody else has any right to pass judgment on me. And it disappears even within contract when you press a button and you say, I agree, because it's too long and it's too hard, or it's placed in a way that stands in the way of something which otherwise has been structured, really very purposely structured. And you're right, this is not simplicity, it's been complexly structured to make it seem like, I'm powerless. It's going to be ridiculous if I read all 20 pages and then I write Apple to say that I don't agree to this or that term and I try to cross it out. I mean, it makes you feel absurd and a time waster and petty. But that really is a description of how the power relations have been structured. So I call them contractarian or libertarian, but they really are, I think, a dispersal of the larger political power that even, again, a narrow jurisprudence of contract used to represent. But it's part of the attack, not just on the humanities, but on the ability to have a language that connects us as human beings, rather than makes all of our transactions this highly mechanistic, you do A and you do B and you do C and you fall down the chute into happy land.
So interesting. Should we take the next question?
I'm Nancy Goldstein, and I finished Brandeis with my doctorate in English literature in 1994. I'm currently, among other things, a journalist. I write for The Guardian, The Nation, The American Prospect. So I would be very, very sorry to see the humanities disappear. I think that George Herbert may have single-handedly saved my stupid 19-year-old sophomore life at Boston University, where I was lucky enough to study with Helen Vendler. But I would also say that the humanities don't seem to me to be any stranger to metrics or brutal oversimplifications or the devaluation of certain bodies of knowledge, frequently bodies that are of color, queer, female, or young. So I have to say that, one of my early memories is taking my anthology on the gender politics of HIV and women to Rutledge in 1994, and being told that I needed to write up a business plan that would prove how many copies I could sell before I could be considered. I remember the kind of debt I left graduate school with. I appreciate Professor Butler mentioning the exploitation of graduate students as cheap labor, and perhaps questioning the moral value of continuing to accept people at very high cost to them into a profession where indeed we come out with enormous debt and very little chance of employment. I also remember bringing Timo Gilmore halfway out of his chair in the 19th century American Romanticism seminar. We were reading the minor works of Washington Irving, Melville, and Hawthorne, and I confessed that I had never read the major works. And he tried to shame me, and I said, and I haven't read Moby Dick, and he got this far, and I said, and I haven't read The Scarlet Letter, and he got this far out of his chair and said, stop, just stop right there. So I don't think that, I guess I'd be interested in hearing in hearing from this panel, and I really appreciate the work that all of you have done. What are some of the ways in which the humanities have created their own irrelevancies?
I want to take that on.
No, Peter, maybe you can do that. There you go.
Look, I mean, it takes us back to the Christoph column that someone mentioned a moment ago. Have the humanities, all university professors become utterly specialized, incapable of talking to anyone outside their field and certainly to the public? It seems to me that's not true. And it seems to me that talking about public intellectuals is probably the wrong path to take, as Judith indeed says in her paper. The question is simply one of language and communication. And it seems to me we are here, we are able to communicate. The problem is the breakdown in the medium through which we communicate. And that's where we have to work reparatively. I think the Christoph column was just viciously wrong. And as I say, you see it every few months in the Times. Let's have the next question.
Hi, I'm a little short. I'm an undergrad student at Lang, the Liberal Arts College. My ears perked up, Dean Germano, when you talked about Sensate Democracy. Professor Butler, I've been carrying this book around. It's a great handy book, but you talk about Sensate Democracy here, and you talk about the eruption in Los Angeles in 2006 of Nuestro Himno, or like our hymn, our anthem, the singing of the national anthem in Spanish. And you say that Agamben and Arendt we don't have language for what this performance is and what this politics is. I study performance and politics, and a lot of, I perform downtown in, the avant-garde, where we make $7 an hour for our performances and then we go away. And so I'm interested, one, in this thing of the academy has a lot of difficulty taking up our field and taking up the questions that we pose with our bodies and with our, that we enact. Like you talk about restaging the street and restaging, the public. So I'm interested in how can we be strategic about not letting our field just continue to get pushed away by the academy? It's something that our professors often warn us about and tell us, don't reduce what you do to language, because why are we privileging language over what we do? I'm also curious about speaking for the humanities. Many of us, I appreciate this the conversation about dispossessing ourselves, but many of us have immediate stakes, material stakes, life chances involved in these conversations that we spend, scores of thousands of dollars to be able to, be involved in seminar, which I really, really appreciate. But so what about speaking from the humanities? from the position of the, those who have a stake in the conversations that others are dispossessing themselves from.
Maybe I can just say two things. One is, might be useful to think about the idea that there are several publics and there are overlapping publics and there's not one public. So, for instance, the public that caricatures the humanities professor as a selfish and elitist person who takes vocational pleasure and doesn't really care about the world or doesn't really care about students or is part of a shaming mechanism, that's one, sure. Waiting for sabbatical, end of story. But there's another, which is really the attack precisely on those kinds of academic enterprises, including performance studies that do cross the boundaries between some academic universes and some public universes, and that becomes targeted precisely as not worthwhile or as a sign of a kind of pervasive left-wing bias within the humanities, right? So there are different kinds of criticisms, and we have to ask who's launching them and for what reason. And sometimes the humanities is faulted for diametrically opposite things, depending on which critic is being foregrounded at the time. And then I guess I just want to say that I think it's a really good question. What are the resources that people who work in the humanities and the arts might bring forward to address the question of student debt? And debt is perhaps another word. Debt is another practice. What would it mean for us not to say, oh, student debt, that's an issue that another discipline has to think about? Actually, every discipline has to think about it, because in all of our classes, there are students who are accumulating debts that are unpayable and who are living lives that are governed by futures of unpayable debt, right? So mortality is going to come, death's going to come, and still that debt will not be paid. And what does it mean to live that life knowing that your entire future is going to be indebted? So we have ways of thinking about that and of bringing our own critical capacities to bear on that issue. And I think it is part of our broader public responsibility to try to make that clear. I guess I would add, many of us have to speak in different registers at different times, depending on who those publics are and who those audiences are. So it's possible to defend work that's difficult and demanding and actually does ask that we patiently work through something that is unfamiliar and even hard. At the same time that we can speak publicly and make clear that we care about the conditions of work and the conditions of education that are imperiled at this time. I don't see a contradiction there. I think we just have to become capable enough of moving across and through those registers.
Can I add something to that and about just a kind of unease about this discussion? Most of you look to be young. Of course, everybody looks young to me these days. But let's say we were having this discussion and we weren't thinking about the university at all. We weren't thinking about the kind of pedagogic function of the humanities. How would the discussion be different? That is to say, who gets to teach what, whether people are paid or not. What if this were a discussion about the humanities and public life, absent questions about universities? I just posed it as a question to you. Would it be a different kind of discussion? Would we have a discussion, for instance, about where are people held ethically to account? Right? And how do you do that? Could you, for instance, online hold people ethically account, and how? I just have to confess to a certain unease about the collapse of the crisis of the humanities into a pedagogical issue or university issue. I think it's much bigger than that.
I agree with that, but I think it's hard to think of the humanities at all without a pedagogic dimension, because
Oh, I don't.
it's-
Oh, I disagree
the
with you.
humanities are about, as Bill was saying, reading and writing for readers, and about dialogue and about the kind of talk that's going on here at the moment. And that has to have a pedagogic dimension. It doesn't have to be a university pedagogy. It can be performed in other ways.
Think if you were a community organizer. If you had a pedagogic function in the community, you would be, and quite rightly, expelled as soon as people could find a way to cut off your job. What is the reason for that? Is that it's a relationship of inequality. You're trying to mobilize a community. You're not trying to teach them, to show them something they don't know. That's what we do in a university. And what I'm saying to you is I just don't, I think the reason why this discussion, tends to get bogged down is that there's a real question about how you have judgment and value in a society among adults where you don't have this pedagogical relationship. What happens after you graduate to the kind of humanistic practices that you engage in? I love universities. I mean, I've chosen to work here rather than somewhere else. But I think this is a discussion that goes in a different direction if you ask, what are the agencies in society that exercise value, that are, and that assert, if you like, dialogic or dialectical values? How can we find those? How can we find something that people our age, elderly people, would see as a kind of democratic forum without reverting to the model of the university?
Well, that's a very good question, but I think it's a different question, right? And it has
No, I think it's about the humanities and public life.
Yeah.
It's about the public life part of this.
But it would also be about institutional arrangements, including
Correct.
museums and symphony orchestras and all that sort of thing.
Well, no, it might be about community organizations, labor unions. Remember those?
If they still exist.
But you know what I'm saying? If the title of our book really is for real, public life, what constitutes a public life? I don't think a university does.
Well, that's an enormous question, and I don't want to
think public universities
but
do?
we have an enormous
I do.
queue
Yeah,
at
much more.
the microphone here. So let's proceed briskly to these questions.
Yes, I'll be brief. I would just like to say that I love your binoculars. I mean, in a way, you can explain the whole discussion, right? Galileo, telescope, quantification, positivistic sciences, instrumental rationality. Anyway, I'm Nash, in words of Herbert Marcuse, a hopeless philosopher to whom politics is inseparable from philosophy. Judith, I would like to thank you for mentioning the Frankfurt School and reminding us of instrumental rationality and Frankfurt School, us who should be the stronghold of it. And I love the humanity rather than humanities. From now on, that's how I'm going to speak about it. And Richard, when you mentioned Burckhardt, that reminded me of Carl Lewith and the book Meaning and History that that Bernard Flo introduced me to. And in there, he mentions his belief in progress that comes from all theological beliefs that then transferred over, and that's maybe something that we didn't have a chance to discuss. But I have a question for Judith. I'm more interested in, actually, again, Marcuse's remark, that technological progress doesn't necessarily imply humanitarian progress. And then as far as this humanitarian progress goes, I know that you're familiar with Jean-Paul Sartre's preface to Frantz Fanon's book, and you wrote a review of it that understood why Sartre had to use, or had to speak in a way that he did, and try to awaken a sense of shame within the French citizens so that they can react. So I was just wondering whether you see such an approach desirable or even possible to have an impact today, mainly the sense of of shame as far as insinuating some kind of a reaction on behalf of the population?
The brief answer is no.
Would you just elaborate for a second, Esther?
I think shaming leads more to paralysis and rigidification than moving people in new directions. I mean, sometimes it can be shocking and disorienting and reorienting, but I don't understand it as a strategy that's useful. And even when Sartre seeks to shame the French bourgeoisie, he's doing it in order to produce a position for himself which is above them. And I think he's not above them.
Thanks.
Hi, I have a brief question. I was wondering what what happens, in your opinion, when the conditions of the humanities, and the inbuilt ethics of the humanities are taken from a place like New York and transplanted into a place like Qatar or China. Right. How does that change or compromise or reconfigure the very basis of what the humanities are about? How do you operate and how do you negotiate in that space?
It's a great question.
A great question.
That's an enormous and enormously important question, but I don't feel that I'm adequate to field it, in part because I haven't had the on-the-ground experience that I think would be really necessary for deriving a responsible engagement with it. You guys?
I have been very critical of my former university, Yale, for setting up a liberal arts college in Singapore, and I see the attraction of that, but how can you set up a liberal arts college which believes in freedom of speech in a state which represses freedom of speech, which does not allow people to be gay, for instance, in fact executes them, at least theoretically. I just don't see how American liberal arts colleges can accept certain political contexts. The hope is always, the pious hope is that they will transform the context, but I don't believe they have that power.
Well, I think your question is a wonderful question. My own experience of that in the Far East is that when you have discussions with people about value, everything is in code. And the interpretive skills that we've been talking about are really put to the test when people want to communicate with each other, but in which they can't communicate with each other overtly in China, because you never know who you're talking to. You may be talking to a policeman who's your student, for instance. So what this, do you know a book by James Scott about hidden transcripts? It's a book you should look at. It's about how people under the conditions that are far different than our own, far more repressive, learn to communicate below the surface. And they become so that they're not held accountable by power, they're not pinned down. And that's an exercise in values, and if you like, in practical criticism. That's a form of literary endeavor which is absolutely necessary for survival. We know nothing of that. No?
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope we can get to the end of our queue, so let's move quickly.
I'll move this quickly. I have spent my whole life as a professor of the humanities, so I'm with you in soul, but I have a lot of thoughts about this. One is, why do you think this is happening now? Why do you think we've moved away from the two cultures? That was ages ago. So why is it coming around again? I think we have to look much more at the social context, at the recession, at the fact that people cannot get jobs. I worked with a lot of students who were immigrants. Their families came from elsewhere, and they would say, I really love history, but my parents want me to major in computer science. And there's a pragmatics here. We're not addressing that at all. The larger social context in which the public life issue is raised. My second question, from having been in universities, or comment, is that there's no way to have interdisciplinary conversations in universities except in small pockets. So we never talk to each other, the person who said the scientists ought to know what the humanities think. It's a rare moment when there is real integration, because we're all working so hard within our own departments, and because there's not any value for young doctoral students, let's say, or others, to really make that leap across. They've got to worry either faculty about tenure or, you know, about jobs, about debt. There is not any kind of structural way to have the kind of conversations, I believe anyway, that are needed now. I'd be curious what you think. And finally, if we start turning the word humanities, I've asked this question for several years as a professor, realizing that does teaching the humanities make us any more human? Think about it with your own colleagues, with your own lives. What do we learn that is transferable to really become better human beings? I've taught media studies for many years as one of the things I do. And when you look at the technologies, Professor Sennett spoke of it, are we being reduced to simplicities? Maybe, but also we have to think about what does it mean soon when we will have chips in our arms or capacities that we've never had before. So writers like Sherry Turkle are writing about what it means to be human now. That's at the heart of the matter. And I feel like the humanities cannot stay in this little bubble of esoteric scholarship, as much as we all might love it who are in it. But the voice for being human in public life at this stage in our society, whether it's abroad or here, seems to me to be of the essence. And I would love to hear anything you have to say about any of this.
Well, thank you. I take that more as a comment than a question. And maybe
Yes.
we should probably move on and have some more. We have time for about one more question, and I see in the queue there Margaret Ferguson, professor at UC Davis and newly elected president of the Modern Language Association. And I'd really like to use whatever feeble authority I have as moderator to ask her to come and ask the last question. Is that okay? Of course. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not very happy about this because there are two people ahead of me in line, and I just jumped the line. But I did want to say that there's a wonderful book by William Clark called The Origins of Academic Charisma, which talks about the metric of applause being introduced by the Prussian state for universities in the middle of the 18th century as some way of measuring the value not just of humanities, but of all lectures that should be measured as useful to the state. And therefore, I think we're going to give you some applause as having, it seems to me, performed something of the messiness of democracy in this effort to have a huge room, be able to speak imperfectly, and you've even performed that among yourselves. It's not neat. However, it seems to me that the university is one place in this society where it sometimes occurs, and the humanities is a metonymy, a symbol for a number of other disciplines where the value cannot be immediately predicted or demonstrated, where is, as Judith Butler said, the place where the genealogy of value is discussed. And it seems to me that that's what the public life is about. And the difference between the ivory tower and the public life is less important than the difficulty of finding a public life at all in our state. What kind of state are we in where the creativity of universities in getting around rules, in getting around utilitarian requirements, is now being contained by a certain kind of international capital logic? And I think of Judith Butler's and my university, the University of California, which is also Ralph Hexter's university. And that comes out of a land act, the Moral Act, which gave the public university a chance to exist if it focused on the mechanic arts and agriculture. It was allowed to exist, and it took 5 years for the first one to start because the states were so worried that this was an experiment in socialism. So they were already having to prove their value. But it seems to me that the amazing thing about universities, where basic research in science is just as threatened as the humanities, because we cannot demonstrate its immediate value. We can't predict it. We can't account for it in that time frame. That it seems to me that this is quite remarkable that the public universities in this country have gotten around the Moral Act. They've somehow or other become comprehensive universities. And now it seems to me that I'm not going to talk about a crisis, but a tipping point where our ability to reproduce that kind of forum, where there's a lot of mess, a lot of people don't get to talk as much as they want. There are translation problems. We have our different languages, but we have a place where we can try. We can model that. And that's not to sound apocalyptic, but I think that that's getting harder to justify. And so I want to thank you for letting us watch you talk and try to talk to us and talk to all of us. And I'd like to applaud you for that.